Chapter 10 of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 10. I become neglected and am provided for. The first act of business Miss Murdstone performed when the day of solemnity was over, and light was freely admitted into the house, was to give Peggotty a month's warning. Much as Peggotty would have disliked such a service, I believe she would have retained it for my sake in preference to the best upon earth. She told me we must part, and told me why, and we condoled with each other in all sincerity. As to me or my future, not a word was said, or a step taken. Happy they would have been, I dare say, if they could have dismissed me at a month's warning too. I mustered courage once to ask Miss Murdstone when I was going back to school, and she answered drily she believed I was not going back at all. I was told nothing more. I was very anxious to know what was going to be done with me, and so was Peggotty, but neither she nor I could pick up any information on the subject. There was one change in my condition which, while it relieved me of a great deal of present uneasiness, might have made me, if I had been capable of considering it closely, yet more uncomfortable about the future. It was this: the constraint that had been put upon me was quite abandoned. I was so far from being required to keep my dull post in the parlour, that on several occasions, when I took my seat there, Miss Murdstone frowned to me to go away. I was so far from being warned off from Peggotty's society, that provided I was not in Mr. Murdstone's, I was never sought out or inquired for. At first I was in daily dread of his taking my education in hand again, or of Miss Murdstone's devoting herself to it. But I soon began to think that such fears were groundless, and that all I had to anticipate was neglect. I did not conceive that this discovery gave me much pain then. I was still giddy with the shock of my mother's death, and in a kind of stunned state as to all tributary things. I can recollect, indeed, to have speculated at odd times on the possibility of my not being taught any more, or cared for any more, and growing up to be a shabby, moody man, lounging an idle life away about the village, as well as on the feasibility of my getting rid of this picture by going away somewhere, like the hero in a story, to seek my fortune. But these were transient visions, daydreams I sat looking at sometimes, as if they were faintly painted or written on the wall of my room, and which, as they melted away, left the wall blank again. "Peggotty," I said in a thoughtful whisper one evening, when I was warming my hands at the kitchen fire, "Mr. Murdstone likes me less than he used to. He never liked me much, Peggotty, but he would rather not even see me now, if he can help it." "Perhaps it's his sorrow," said Peggotty, stroking my hair. "I am sure, Peggotty, I am sorry too. If I believed it was his sorrow, I should not think of it at all, but it's not that. Oh no, it's not that." "How do you know it's not that?" said Peggotty after a silence. "Oh, his sorrow is another and quite a different thing. He is sorry at this moment, sitting by the fireside with Miss Murdstone, but if I was to go in, Peggotty, he would be something besides." "What would he be?" said Peggotty. "Angry," I answered, with an involuntary imitation of his dark frown. "If he was only sorry, he wouldn't look at me as he does. I am only sorry, and it makes me feel kinder." Peggotty said nothing for a little while, and I warmed my hands as silent as she. "Davy," she said at length. "Yes, Peggotty." "I have tried, my dear, all ways I could think of, all the ways there are, and all the ways there ain't, in short, to get a suitable service here in Blunderstone, but there's no such a thing, my love." "And what do you mean to do, Peggotty?" says I wistfully. "Do you mean to go and seek your fortune?" "I expect I shall be forced to go to Yarmouth," replied Peggotty, "and live there." "You might have gone further off," I said, brightening a little, "and been as bad as lost. I shall see you sometimes, my dear old Peggotty, there. You won't be quite at the other end of the world, will you?" "Contrary ways, please God," cried Peggotty with great animation. "As long as you are here, my pet, I shall come over every week of my life to see you. One day every week of my life." I felt a great weight taken off my mind by this promise, but even this was not all, for Peggotty went on to say, "I'm a-going, Davy, you see, to my brother's first, for another fortnight's visit, just till I have had time to look about me, and to get something like myself again. Now, I have been thinking that perhaps, as they don't want you here at present, you might be let to go along with me. If anything short of being in a different relation to every one about me Peggotty excepted, could have given me a sense of pleasure at that time, it would have been this project of all others. The idea of being again surrounded by those honest faces shining welcome on me, of renewing the peacefulness of the sweet Sunday morning, when the bells were ringing, the stones dropping in the water, and the shadowy ships breaking through the mist, of roaming up and down with little Emily, telling her my troubles, and finding charms against them in the shells and pebbles on the beach, made a calm in my heart. It was ruffled next moment, to be sure, by a doubt of Miss Murdstone's giving her consent, but even that was set at rest soon, for she came out to take an evening grope in the store closet, while we were yet in conversation, and Peggotty, with a boldness that amazed me, broached the topic on the spot. "The boy will be idle there," said Miss Murdstone, looking into a pickle jar, "and idleness is the root of all evil. But to be sure, he will be idle here, or anywhere, in my opinion." Peggotty had an angry answer ready, I could see, but she swallowed it for my sake, and remained silent. "Humph," said Miss Murdstone, still keeping her eye on the pickles. "It is of more importance than anything else, it is of paramount importance, that my brother should not be disturbed, or made uncomfortable. I suppose I had better say yes." I thanked her, without making any demonstration of joy, lest it should induce her to withdraw her assent, nor could I help thinking this a prudent course, since she looked at me out of the pickle jar with as great an access of sourness as if her black eyes had absorbed its contents. However, the permission was given, and was never retracted, for when the month was out, Peggotty and I were ready to depart. Mr. Barkis came into the house for Peggotty's boxes. I had never known him to pass the garden gate before, but on this occasion he came into the house, and he gave me a look as he shouldered the largest box and went out, which I thought had meaning in it, if meaning could ever be said to find its way into Mr. Barkis's visage. Peggotty was naturally in low spirits at leaving what had been her home so many years, and where the two strong attachments of her life, for my mother and myself, had been formed. She had been walking in the churchyard too, very early, and she got into the cart and sat in it with her handkerchief at her eyes. As long as she remained in this condition, Mr. Barkis gave no sign of life whatever. He sat in his usual place and attitude, like a great stuffed figure. But when she began to look about her, and to speak to me, he nodded his head, and grinned several times. I have not the least notion at whom, or what he meant by it. "It's a beautiful day, Mr. Barkis," I said, as an act of politeness. "It ain't bad," said Mr. Barkis, who generally qualified his speech, and rarely committed himself. "Peggotty is quite comfortable now, Mr. Barkis," I remarked for his satisfaction. "Is she though?" said Mr. Barkis. After reflecting about it with a sagacious air, Mr. Barkis eyed her and said, "Are you pretty comfortable?" Peggotty laughed, and answered in the affirmative. "But really and truly, you know, are you?" growled Mr. Barkis, sliding nearer to her on the seat, and nudging her with his elbow. "Are you? Really and truly pretty comfortable? Are you, eh?" At each of these inquiries Mr. Barkis shuffled nearer to her, and gave her another nudge, so that at last we were all crowded together in the left-hand corner of the cart, and I was so squeezed that I could hardly bear it. Peggotty calling his attentions to my sufferings, Mr. Barkis gave me a little more room at once, and got away by degrees. But I could not help observing that he seemed to think he had hit upon a wonderful expedient for expressing himself in a neat, agreeable, and pointed manner, without the inconvenience of inventing conversation. He manifestly chuckled over it for some time. By and by he turned to Peggotty again, and repeating, "Are you pretty comfortable though?" bore down upon us as before, until the breath was nearly edged out of my body. By and by he made another descent upon us with the same inquiry and the same result. At length I got up whenever I saw him coming, and standing on the footboard pretended to look at the prospect, after which I did very well. He was so polite as to stop at a public house expressly on our account, and entertain us with broiled mutton and beer. Even when Peggotty was in the act of drinking, he was seized with one of those approaches, and almost choked her. But as we drew near to the end of our journey, he had more and more to do, and less time for gallantry, and when we got on Yarmouth pavement, we were all too much shaken and jolted, I apprehend, to have any leisure for anything else. Mr. Peggotty and Ham waited for us at the old place. They received me and Peggotty in an affectionate manner, and shook hands with Mr. Barkis, who, with his hat on the very back of his head, and a shamefaced leer upon his countenance and pervading his very legs, presented but a vacant appearance, I thought. They each took one of Peggotty's trunks, and we were going away, when Mr. Barkis solemnly made a sign to me with his forefinger to come under an archway. "I say," growled Mr. Barkis, "it was all right." I looked up into his face and answered, with an attempt to be very profound, "Oh." "It didn't come to an end there," said Mr. Barkis, nodding confidentially. "It was all right." Again I answered, "Oh." "You know who was willing," said my friend. "It was Barkis, and Barkis only." I nodded assent. "It's all right," said Mr. Barkis, shaking hands. "I'm a friend of yourn. You made it all right first. It's all right." In his attempts to be particularly lucid, Mr. Barkis was so extremely mysterious, that I might have stood looking in his face for an hour, and most assuredly would have got as much information out of it as out of the face of a clock that had stopped, but for Peggotty's calling me away. As we were going along, she asked me what he had said, and I told her he had said it was all right. "Like his impudence," said Peggotty, "but I don't mind that. Davy dear, what should you think if I was to think of being married?" "Why, I suppose you would like me as much then, Peggotty, as you do now," I returned after a little consideration. Greatly to the astonishment of the passengers in the street, as well as of the relations going on before, the good soul was obliged to stop and embrace me on the spot, with many protestations of her unalterable love. "Tell me what you should say, darling," she asked again when this was over, and we were walking on. "If you are thinking of being married to Mr. Barkis, Peggotty." "Yes," said Peggotty, "I should think it would be a very good thing, for then, you know, Peggotty, you would always have the horse and cart to bring you over to see me, and could come for nothing, and be sure of coming." "The sense of the dear," cried Peggotty, "what I have been thinking of this month back. Yes, my precious, and I think I should be more independent altogether, you see, let alone my working with a better heart in my own house, than I could in anybody else's now. I don't know what I might be fit for now as a servant to a stranger. And I shall always be near my pretty's resting place," said Peggotty, musing, "and be able to see it when I like, and when I lie down to rest, I may be laid not far off from my darling girl." We neither of us said anything for a little while. "But I wouldn't so much as give it another thought," said Peggotty cheerily, "if my Davy was any ways against it. Not if I had been asked in church 30 times 3 times over, and was wearing out the ring in my pocket." "Look at me, Peggotty," I replied, "and see if I am not really glad, and don't truly wish it," as indeed I did with all my heart. "Well, my life," said Peggotty, giving me a squeeze, "I have thought of it night and day, every way I can, and I hope the right way, but I'll think of it again, and speak to my brother about it, and in the meantime we'll keep it to ourselves, Davy, you and me. Barkis is a good plain creature," said Peggotty, "and if I tried to do my duty by him, I think it would be my fault if I wasn't pretty comfortable," said Peggotty, laughing heartily. This quotation from Mr. Barkis was so appropriate, and tickled us both so much, that we laughed again and again, and were quite in a pleasant humour when we came within view of Mr. Peggotty's cottage. It looked just the same, except that it may perhaps have shrunk a little in my eyes, and Mrs. Gummidge was waiting at the door as if she had stood there ever since. All within was the same, down to the seaweed in the blue mug in my bedroom. I went into the outhouse to look about me, and the very same lobsters, crabs, and crawfish, possessed by the same desire to pinch the world in general, appeared to be in the same state of conglomeration in the same old corner. But there was no little Emily to be seen, so I asked Mr. Peggotty where she was. "She's at school, sir," said Mr. Peggotty, wiping the heat consequent on the porterage of Peggotty's box from his forehead. "She'll be home," looking at the Dutch clock, "in from 20 minutes to half an hour's time. We all of us feel the loss of her, bless ye." Mrs. Gummidge moaned. "Cheer up, Martha," cried Mr. Peggotty. "I feel it more than anybody else," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I'm a lone, lorn creature." and she used to be almost the only thing that didn't go contrary with me.' Mrs. Gummidge, whimpering and shaking her head, applied herself to blowing the fire. Mr. Peggotty, looking round upon us while she was so engaged, said in a low voice, which he shaded with his hand, 'The old un.' From this I rightly conjectured that no improvement had taken place since my last visit in the state of Mrs. Gummidge's spirits. Now the old place was, or it should have been, quite as delightful a place as ever, and yet it did not impress me in the same way. I felt rather disappointed with it. Perhaps it was because little Emily was not home yet. I knew the way by which she would come, and presently found myself strolling along the path to meet her. A figure appeared in the distance before long, and I soon knew it to be Emily, who was a little creature still in stature, though she was grown. But when she drew nearer, and I saw her blue eyes looking bluer, and her dimpled face looking brighter, and her whole self prettier and gayer, a curious feeling came over me that made me pretend not to know her, and pass by as if I were looking at something a long way off. I have done such a thing since in later life, or I am mistaken. Little Emily didn't care a bit. She saw me well enough, but instead of turning round and calling after me, ran away laughing. This obliged me to run after her, and she ran so fast that we were very near the cottage before I caught her. 'Oh, it's you, is it?' said little Emily. 'Why, you knew who it was, Emily,' said I. 'And didn't you know who it was?' said Emily. I was going to kiss her, but she covered her cherry lips with her hands, and said she wasn't a baby now, and ran away, laughing more than ever, into the house. She seemed to delight in teasing me, which was a change in her I wondered at very much. The tea table was ready, and our little locker was put into its old place, but instead of coming to sit by me, she went and bestowed her company upon that grumbling Mrs. Gummidge, and on Mr. Peggotty's inquiring why, rumpled her hair all over her face to hide it, and could do nothing but laugh. 'A little puss it is,' said Mr. Peggotty, patting her with his great hand. 'So she is, so she is,' cried Ham. 'Master Davy Bore, so she is.' And he sat and chuckled at her for some time, in a state of mingled admiration and delight, that made his face a burning red. Little Emily was spoiled by them all, in fact, and by no one more than Mr. Peggotty himself, whom she could have coaxed into anything by only going and laying her cheek against his rough whisker. That was my opinion at least when I saw her do it, and I held Mr. Peggotty to be thoroughly in the right. But she was so affectionate and sweet-natured, and had such a pleasant manner of being both sly and shy at once, that she captivated me more than ever. She was tender-hearted too, for when, as we sat round the fire after tea, an allusion was made by Mr. Peggotty over his pipe to the loss I had sustained, the tears stood in her eyes, and she looked at me so kindly across the table, that I felt quite thankful to her. 'Ah,' said Mr. Peggotty, taking up her curls and running them over his hand like water, 'here's another orphan, you see, sir. And here,' said Mr. Peggotty, giving Ham a backhanded knock in the chest, 'is another of 'em, though he don't look much like it.' 'If I had you for my guardian, Mr. Peggotty,' said I, shaking my head, 'I don't think I should feel much like it.' 'Well said, Master Davy Bore,' cried Ham in an ecstasy. 'Hooray, well said. No more you wouldn't, ha ha.' Here he returned Mr. Peggotty's backhander, and little Emily got up and kissed Mr. Peggotty. 'And how's your friend, sir?' said Mr. Peggotty to me. 'Steerforth,' said I. 'That's the name,' cried Mr. Peggotty, turning to Ham. 'I knowed it was something in our way.' 'You said it was Rutherford,' observed Ham, laughing. 'Well,' retorted Mr. Peggotty, 'and you steer with a rudder, don't ye? And it ain't far off. How is he, sir?' 'He was very well indeed when I came away, Mr. Peggotty.' 'There's a friend,' said Mr. Peggotty, stretching out his pipe. 'There's a friend, if you talk of friends. Why, Lord love my heart alive, if it ain't a treat to look at him.' 'He is very handsome, is he not?' said I, my heart warming with this praise. 'Handsome!' cried Mr. Peggotty. 'He stands up to you why, I don't know what he don't stand up to you like. He's so bold.' 'Yes, that's just his character,' said I. 'He's as brave as a lion, and you can't think how frank he is, Mr. Peggotty.' 'And I do suppose now,' said Mr. Peggotty, looking at me through the smoke of his pipe, 'that in the way of book learning, he'd take the wind out of almost anything.' 'Yes,' said I, delighted, 'he knows everything. He is astonishingly clever. "There's a friend," murmured Mr. Peggotty, with a grave toss of his head. "Nothing seems to cost him any trouble," I said. "He knows a task if he only looks at it. He's the best cricketer you ever saw. He will give you almost as many men as you like at draughts, and beat you easily." Mr. Peggotty gave his head another toss, as much as to say, "Of course he will." "He's such a speaker," I pursued, "that he can win anybody over, and I don't know what you'd say if you were to hear him sing, Mr. Peggotty." Mr. Peggotty gave his head another toss, as much as to say, "I have no doubt of it." "Then he's such a generous, fine, noble fellow," said I, quite carried away with my favourite theme, "that it's hardly possible to give him as much praise as he deserves. I am sure I can never feel thankful enough for the generosity with which he has protected me, so much younger and lower in the school than himself." I was running on very fast indeed, when my eyes rested on little Emily's face, which was bent forward over the table, listening with the deepest attention, her breath held, her blue eyes sparkling like jewels, and the colour mantling in her cheeks. She looked so extraordinarily earnest and pretty, that I stopped in a sort of wonder, and they all observed her at the same time, for as I stopped, they laughed and looked at her. "Emily's like me," said Peggotty, "and would like to see him." Emily was confused by our all observing her, and hung down her head, and her face was covered with blushes. Glancing up presently through her stray curls, and seeing that we were all looking at her still, I am sure I for one could have looked at her for hours, she ran away, and kept away till it was nearly bedtime. I lay down in the old little bed in the stern of the boat, and the wind came moaning on across the flat as it had done before. But I could not help fancying now that it moaned of those who were gone, and instead of thinking that the sea might rise in the night and float the boat away, I thought of the sea that had risen, since I last heard those sounds, and drowned my happy home. I recollect, as the wind and water began to sound fainter in my ears, putting a sort of clause into my prayers, petitioning that I might grow up to marry little Emily, and so dropping lovingly asleep. The days passed pretty much as they had passed before, except, it was a great exception, that little Emily and I seldom wandered on the beach now. She had tasks to learn and needlework to do, and was absent during a great part of each day. But I felt that we should not have had those old wanderings, even if it had been otherwise. Wild and full of childish whims as Emily was, she was more of a little woman than I had supposed. She seemed to have got a great distance away from me in a little more than a year. She liked me, but she laughed at me, and tormented me, and when I went to meet her, stole home another way, and was laughing at the door when I came back disappointed. The best times were when she sat quietly at work in the doorway, and I sat on the wooden step at her feet, reading to her. It seems to me, at this hour, that I have never seen such sunlight as on those bright April afternoons, that I have never seen such a sunny little figure as I used to see, sitting in the doorway of the old boat, that I have never beheld such a sky, such water, such glorified ships sailing away into golden air. On the very first evening after our arrival, Mr. Barkis appeared in an exceedingly vacant and awkward condition, and with a bundle of oranges tied up in a handkerchief. As he made no allusion of any kind to this property, he was supposed to have left it behind him by accident when he went away, until Ham, running after him to restore it, came back with the information that it was intended for Peggotty. After that occasion he appeared every evening at exactly the same hour, and always with a little bundle, to which he never alluded, and which he regularly put behind the door and left there. These offerings of affection were of a most various and eccentric description. Among them I remember a double set of pig's trotters, a huge pincushion, half a bushel or so of apples, a pair of jet earrings, some Spanish onions, a box of dominoes, a canary bird and cage, and a leg of pickled pork. Mr. Barkis's wooing, as I remember it, was altogether of a peculiar kind. He very seldom said anything, but would sit by the fire in much the same attitude as he sat in his cart, and stared heavily at Peggotty, who was opposite. One night being, as I suppose, inspired by love, he made a dart at the bit of candle wax she kept for her thread, and put it in his waistcoat pocket, and carried it off. After that, his great delight was to produce it when it was wanted, sticking to the lining of his pocket in a partially melted state, and pocket it again when it was done with. He seemed to enjoy himself very much, and not to feel at all called upon to talk. Even when he took Peggotty out for a walk on the flats, He had no uneasiness on that head, I believe, contenting himself with now and then asking her if she was pretty comfortable, and I remember that sometimes after he was gone, Peggotty would throw her apron over her face and laugh for half an hour. Indeed, we were all more or less amused, except that miserable Mrs. Gummidge, whose courtship would appear to have been of an exactly parallel nature, she was so continually reminded by these transactions of the old one. At length, when the term of my visit was nearly expired, it was given out that Peggotty and Mr. Barkis were going to make a day's holiday together, and that little Emily and I were to accompany them. I had but a broken sleep the night before, in anticipation of the pleasure of a whole day with Emily. We were all astir betimes in the morning, and while we were yet at breakfast, Mr. Barkis appeared in the distance, driving a chaise cart towards the object of his affections. Peggotty was dressed as usual, in her neat and quiet mourning, but Mr. Barkis bloomed in a new blue coat, of which the tailor had given him such good measure that the cuffs would have rendered gloves unnecessary in the coldest weather, while the collar was so high that it pushed his hair up on end on the top of his head. His bright buttons too were of the largest size. Rendered complete by drab pantaloons and a buff waistcoat, I thought Mr. Barkis a phenomenon of respectability. When we were all in a bustle outside the door, I found that Mr. Peggotty was prepared with an old shoe, which was to be thrown after us for luck, and which he offered to Mrs. Gummidge for that purpose. "No, it had better be done by somebody else, Dan'l," said Mrs. Gummidge. "I'm a lone, lorn creature myself, and everything that reminds me of creatures that ain't lone and lorn goes contrary with me." "Come, old gal," cried Mr. Peggotty, "take and heave it." "No, Dan'l," returned Mrs. Gummidge, whimpering and shaking her head. "If I felt less, I could do more. You don't feel like me, Dan'l. Things don't go contrary with you, nor you with them. You had better do it yourself." But here Peggotty, who had been going about from one to the other in a hurried way, kissing everybody, called out from the cart, in which we were all by this time, Emily and I on two little chairs side by side, that Mrs. Gummidge must do it. So Mrs. Gummidge did it, and I am sorry to relate, cast a damp upon the festive characters of our departure, by immediately bursting into tears and sinking subdued into the arms of Ham, with the declaration that she knowed she was a burden, and had better be carried to the house at once, which I really thought was a sensible idea that Ham might have acted on. We went away, however, on our holiday excursion, and the first thing we did was to stop at a church, where Mr. Barkis tied the horse to some rails and went in with Peggotty, leaving little Emily and me alone in the chaise. I took that occasion to put my arm round Emily's waist, and propose that as I was going away so very soon now, we should determine to be very affectionate to one another, and very happy all day. Little Emily consenting and allowing me to kiss her, I became desperate, informing her, I recollect, that I never could love another, and that I was prepared to shed the blood of anybody who should aspire to her affections. How merry little Emily made herself about it! With what a demure assumption of being immensely older and wiser than I, the fairy little woman said I was a silly boy, and then laughed so charmingly that I forgot the pain of being called by that disparaging name, in the pleasure of looking at her. Mr. Barkis and Peggotty were a good while in the church, but came out at last, and then we drove away into the country. As we were going along, Mr. Barkis turned to me and said with a wink, by the by, I should hardly have thought before that he could wink, "What name was it that I wrote up in the cart?" "Clara Peggotty," I answered. "What name would it be as I should write up now, if there was a tilt here?" "Clara Peggotty again," I suggested. "Clara Peggotty Barkis," returned he, and burst into a roar of laughter that shook the chaise. In a word, they were married, and had gone into the church for no other purpose. Peggotty was resolved that it should be quietly done, and the clerk had given her away, and there had been no witnesses of the ceremony. She was a little confused when Mr. Barkis made this abrupt announcement of their union, and could not hug me enough in token of her unimpaired affection. But she soon became herself again, and said that she was very glad it was over. We drove to a little inn in a by road, where we were expected, and where we had a very comfortable dinner, and passed the day with great satisfaction. If Peggotty had been married every day for the last 10 years, she could hardly have been more at her ease about it. It made no sort of difference in her. She was just the same as ever, and went out for a stroll with little Emily and me before tea, while Mr. Barkis philosophically smoked his pipe, and enjoyed himself, I suppose, with the contemplation of his happiness. If so, it sharpened his appetite, for I distinctly called to mind that although he had eaten a good deal of pork and greens at dinner, and had finished off with a fowl or two, he was obliged to have cold boiled bacon for tea, and disposed of a large quantity without any emotion. I have often thought since what an odd, innocent, out of the way kind of wedding it must have been. We got into the chaise again soon after dark, and drove cosily back, looking up at the stars and talking about them. I was their chief exponent, and opened Mr. Barkis's mind to an amazing extent. I told him all I knew, but he would have believed anything I might have taken it into my head to impart to him, for he had a profound veneration for my abilities, and informed his wife in my hearing, on that very occasion, that I was a young Roscius, by which I think he meant prodigy. When we had exhausted the subject of the stars, or rather when I had exhausted the mental faculties of Mr. Barkis, little Emily and I made a cloak of an old wrapper, and sat under it for the rest of the journey. Ah, how I loved her! What happiness, I thought, if we were married, and we were going away anywhere to live among the trees and in the fields, never growing older, never growing wiser, children ever, rambling hand in hand through sunshine and among flowery meadows, laying down our heads on moss at night, in a sweet sleep of purity and peace, and buried by the birds when we were dead. Some such picture, with no real world in it, bright with the light of our innocence, and vague as the stars afar off, was in my mind all the way. I am glad to think there were two such guileless hearts at Peggotty's marriage as little Emily and mine. I am glad to think the Loves and Graces took such airy forms in its homely procession. Well, we came to the old boat again in good time at night, and there Mr. and Mrs. Barkis bade us good-bye, and drove away snugly to their own home. I felt then for the first time that I had lost Peggotty. I should have gone to bed with a sore heart indeed, under any other roof but that which sheltered little Emily's head. Mr. Peggotty and Ham knew what was in my thoughts as well as I did, and were ready with some supper and their hospitable faces to drive it away. Little Emily came and sat beside me on the locker for the only time in all that visit, and it was altogether a wonderful close to a wonderful day. It was a night tide, and soon after we went to bed Mr. Peggotty and Ham went out to fish. I felt very brave at being left alone in the solitary house, the protector of Emily and Mrs. Gummidge, and only wished that a lion or serpent, or any ill-disposed monster, would make an attack upon us, that I might destroy him and cover myself with glory. But as nothing of this sort happened to be walking about on Yarmouth flats that night, I provided the best substitute I could by dreaming of dragons until morning. With morning came Peggotty, who called to see me as usual under my window, as if Mr. Barkis the carrier had been from first to last a dream too. After breakfast she took me to her own home, and a beautiful little home it was. Of all the movables in it, I must have been impressed by a certain old bureau of some dark wood in the parlour. The tile-floored kitchen was the general sitting room, with a retreating top which opened, let down, and became a desk, within which was a large quarto edition of Fox's Book of Martyrs. This precious volume, of which I do not recollect one word, I immediately discovered and immediately applied myself to, and I never visited the house afterwards, but I kneeled on a chair, opened the casket where this gem was enshrined, spread my arms over the desk, and fell to devouring the book afresh. I was chiefly edified, I am afraid, by the pictures, which were numerous and represented all kinds of dismal horrors, but the Martyrs and Peggotty's house have been inseparable in my mind ever since, and are now. I took leave of Mr. Peggotty and Ham, and Mrs. Gummidge and little Emily that day, and passed the night at Peggotty's, in a little room in the roof, with the crocodile book on a shelf by the bed's head, which was to be always mine, Peggotty said, and should always be kept for me in exactly the same state. "Young or old, Davy dear, as long as I am alive, and I have this house over my head," said Peggotty, "you shall find it as if I expected you here directly any minute. I shall keep it every day as I used to keep your old little room, my darling, and if you was to go to China, you might think of it being kept just the same, all the time you were away." I felt the truth and constancy of my old dear nurse with all my heart, and thanked her as well as I could. That was not very well, for she spoke to me thus, with her arms round my neck, in the morning, and I was going home in the morning, and I went home in the morning, with herself and Mr. Barkis in the cart. They left me at the gate, not easily or lightly, and it was a strange sight to see the cart go on, taking Peggotty away, and leaving me under the old elm trees looking at the house, in which there was no face to look on mine with love or liking any more. And now I fell into a state of neglect, which I cannot look back upon without compassion. I fell at once into a solitary condition, apart from all friendly notice, apart from the society of all other boys of my own age, apart from all companionship but my own spiritless thoughts, which seems to cast its gloom upon this paper as I write. What would I have given to have been sent to the hardest school that ever was kept, to have been taught something, anyhow, anywhere? No such hope dawned upon me. They disliked me, and they sullenly, sternly, steadily overlooked me. I think Mr. Murdstone's means were straitened at about this time, but it is little to the purpose. He could not bear me, and in putting me from him, he tried, as I believe, to put away the notion that I had any claim upon him, and succeeded. I was not actively ill-used, I was not beaten or starved, but the wrong that was done to me had no intervals of relenting, and was done in a systematic, passionless manner. Day after day, week after week, month after month, I was coldly neglected. I wonder sometimes, when I think of it, what they would have done if I had been taken ill with an illness, whether I should have lain down in my lonely room and languished through it in my usual solitary way, or whether anybody would have helped me out. When Mr. and Mrs. Murdstone were at home, I took my meals with them. In their absence, I ate and drank by myself. At all times I lounged about the house and neighbourhood quite disregarded, except that they were jealous of my making any friends, thinking perhaps that if I did I might complain to someone. For this reason, though Mr. Chillip often asked me to go and see him, he was a widower, having some years before that lost a little small light-haired wife, whom I can just remember connecting in my own thoughts with a pale tortoise-shell cat. It was but seldom that I enjoyed the happiness of passing an afternoon in his closet of a surgery, reading some book that was new to me, with the smell of the whole pharmacopoeia coming up my nose, or pounding something in a mortar under his mild directions. For the same reason, added no doubt to the dislike of her, I was seldom allowed to visit Peggotty. Faithful to her promise, she either came to see me, or met me somewhere near, once every week, and never empty-handed. But many and bitter were the disappointments I had in being refused permission to pay a visit to her at her house. Some few times, however, at long intervals, I was allowed to go there, and then I found that Mr. Barkis was something of a miser, or, as Peggotty dutifully expressed it, was a little near, and kept a heap of money in a box under his bed, which he pretended was only full of coats and trousers. In this coffer his riches hid themselves with such a tenacious modesty, that the smallest instalments could be only tempted out by artifice, so that Peggotty had to prepare a long and elaborate scheme, a very gunpowder plot, for every Saturday's expenses. All this time I was so conscious of the waste of any promise I had given, and of my being utterly neglected, that I should have been perfectly miserable, I have no doubt, but for the old books. They were my only comfort, and I was as true to them as they were to me, and read them over and over, I don't know how many times more. I now approached a period in my life which I can never lose the remembrance of while I remember anything, and the recollection of which has often, without any invocation, come before me like a ghost, and haunted happier times. I had been out one day loitering somewhere in the listless, meditative manner that my way of life engendered, when, turning the corner of a lane near the house, I came upon Mr. Murdstone walking with a gentleman. I was confused, and was going by them, when the gentleman cried, "What, Brooks?" "No, sir, David Copperfield," I said. "Don't tell me, you are Brooks," said the gentleman. "You are Brooks of Sheffield, that's your name." At these words I observed the gentleman more attentively. His laugh coming to my remembrance too, I knew him to be Mr. Quinion, whom I had gone over to Lowestoft with Mr. Murdstone to see, before—it's no matter, I need not recall when. "And how do you get on, and where are you being educated, Brooks?" said Mr. Quinion. He had put his hand upon my shoulder, and turned me about to walk with them. I did not know what to reply, and glanced dubiously at Mr. Murdstone. "He is at home at present," said the latter. "He has not been educated anywhere. I don't know what to do with him. He is a difficult subject." That old double look was on me for a moment, and then his eyes darkened with a frown, as it turned in its aversion elsewhere. "Humph," said Mr. Quinion, looking at us both, I thought, Fine weather. Silence ensued, and I was considering how I could best disengage my shoulder from his hand, and go away, when he said, 'I suppose you are a pretty sharp fellow still, Brooks?' 'Ay, he is sharp enough,' said Mr. Murdstone impatiently. 'You had better let him go. He will not thank you for troubling him.' On this hint Mr. Quinion released me, and I made the best of my way home. Looking back, as I turned into the front garden, I saw Mr. Murdstone leaning against the wicket of the churchyard, and Mr. Quinion talking to him. They were both looking after me, and I felt that they were speaking of me. Mr. Quinion lay at our house that night. After breakfast next morning, I had put my chair away, and was going out of the room, when Mr. Murdstone called me back. He then gravely repaired to another table, where his sister sat herself at her desk. Mr. Quinion, with his hands in his pockets, stood looking out of the window, and I stood looking at them all. 'David,' said Mr. Murdstone, 'to the young this is a world for action, not for moping and droning in.' 'As you do,' added his sister. 'Jane Murdstone, leave this to me, if you please. I say, David, to the young this is a world for action, and not for moping and droning in. It is especially so for a young boy of your disposition, which requires a great deal of correcting, and to which no greater service can be done than to force it to conform to the ways of the working world, and to bend it and break it.' 'For stubbornness won't do here,' said his sister. 'What it wants is to be crushed, and crushed it must be, shall be too.' He gave her a look, half in remonstrance, half in approval, and went on. 'I suppose you know, David, that I am not rich. At any rate, you know it now. You have received some considerable education already. Education is costly, and even if it were not, and I could afford it, I am of opinion that it would not be at all advantageous to you to be kept at school. What is before you is a fight with the world, and the sooner you begin it the better.' I think it occurred to me that I had already begun it in my poor way, but it occurs to me now, whether or no. 'You have heard the counting house mentioned sometimes?' said Mr. Murdstone. 'The counting house, sir?' I repeated. 'Of Murdstone and Grimby in the wine trade,' he replied. I suppose I looked uncertain, for he went on hastily. 'You have heard the counting house mentioned, or the business, or the cellars, or the wharf, or something about it?' 'I think I have heard the business mentioned, sir,' I said, remembering what I vaguely knew of his and his sister's resources, 'but I don't know when.' 'It does not matter when,' he returned. 'Mr. Quinion manages that business.' I glanced at the latter deferentially, as he stood looking out of the window. 'Mr. Quinion suggests that it gives employment to some other boys, and that he sees no reason why it shouldn't, on the same terms, give employment to you.' He having, Mr. Quinion observed in a low voice, and half turning round, 'no other prospect, Murdstone.' Mr. Murdstone, with an impatient, even an angry gesture, resumed without noticing what he had said. 'Those terms are, that you will earn enough for yourself to provide for your eating and drinking, and pocket money. Your lodging, which I have arranged for, will be paid by me. So will your washing.' 'Which will be kept down to my estimate,' said his sister. 'Your clothes will be looked after for you too,' said Mr. Murdstone, 'as you will not be able, yet a while, to get them for yourself. So you are now going to London, David, with Mr. Quinion, to begin the world on your own account.' 'In short, you are provided for,' observed his sister, 'and will please to do your duty.' Though I quite understood that the purpose of this announcement was to get rid of me, I have no distinct remembrance whether it pleased or frightened me. My impression is, that I was in a state of confusion about it, and, oscillating between the 2 points, touched neither. Nor had I much time for the clearing of my thoughts, as Mr. Quinion was to go upon the morrow. Behold me on the morrow, in a much worn little white hat, with a black crape around it for my mother, a black jacket, and a pair of hard, stiff corduroy trousers, which Miss Murdstone considered the best armour for the legs in that fight with the world which is now to come off. Behold me so attired, and with my little worldly all before me in a small trunk, sitting, a lone lorn child, as Mrs. Gummidge might have said, in the post chaise that was carrying Mr. Quinion to the London coach at Yarmouth. See how our house and church are lessening in the distance, how the grave beneath the trees is blotted out by intervening objects, how the spire points upwards from my old playground no more, and the sky is empty. End of chapter 10. David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 11. I begin life on my own account and don't like it. I know enough of the world now to have almost lost the capacity of being much surprised by anything, but it is a matter of some surprise to me even now that I can have been so easily thrown away at such an age. A child of excellent abilities and with strong powers of observation, quick, eager, delicate, and soon hurt bodily or mentally, it seems wonderful to me that nobody should have made any sign in my behalf. But none was made, and I became, at 10 years old, a little labouring hind in the service of Murdstone and Grinby. Murdstone and Grinby's warehouse was at the waterside. It was down in Blackfriars. Modern improvements have altered the place, but it was the last house at the bottom of a narrow street, curving down to the river, with some stairs at the end where people took boat. It was a crazy old house with a wharf of its own, abutting on the water when the tide was in, and on the mud when the tide was out, and literally overrun with rats. Its panelled rooms, discoloured with the dirt and smoke of 100 years, I dare say, its decaying floors and staircase, the squeaking and scuffling of the old grey rats down in the cellars, and the dirt and rottenness of the place, are things not of many years ago in my mind, but of the present instant. They are all before me just as they were in the evil hour when I went among them for the first time, with my trembling hand in Mr. Quinion's. Murdstone and Grinby's trade was among a good many kinds of people, but an important branch of it was in the supply of wines and spirits to certain packet ships. I forget now where they chiefly went, but I think there were some among them that made voyages both to the East and West Indies. I know that a great many empty bottles were one of the consequences of this traffic, and that certain men and boys were employed to examine them against the light, and reject those that were flawed, and to rinse and wash them. When the empty bottles ran short, there were labels to be pasted on full ones, or corks to be fitted to them, or seals to be put upon the corks, or finished bottles to be packed in cases. All this work was my work, and of the boys employed upon it I was one. There were 3 or 4 of us, counting me. My working place was established in a corner of the warehouse where Mr. Quinion could see me, when he chose to stand up on the bottom rail of his stool in the counting house and look at me through a window above the desk. Hither, on the first morning of my so auspiciously beginning life on my own account, the oldest of the regular boys was summoned to show me my business. His name was Micawber, and he wore a ragged apron and a paper cap. He informed me that his father was a bargeman, and walked in a black velvet headdress in the Lord Mayor's show. He also informed me that our principal associate would be another boy whom he introduced to me by the extraordinary name of Mealy Potatoes. I discovered, however, that this youth had not been christened by that name, but that it had been bestowed upon him in the warehouse on account of his complexion, which was pale or mealy. Mealy's father was a waterman, who had the additional distinction of being a fireman, and was engaged as such at one of the large theatres, where some young relations of Mealy's, I think his little sister, did imps in the pantomimes. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship, compared these henceforth everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, not to say with Steerforth, Traddles, and the rest of those boys, and felt my hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my bosom. The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly without hope now, of the shame I felt in my position, and of the misery that it was to my young heart to believe that day by day what I had learnt and thought and delighted in, and raised my fancy and my emulation up by, would pass away from me little by little, never to be brought back any more, could not be written. As often as Mick Walker went away in the course of the afternoon, I mingled my tears with the water in which I was washing the bottles, and sobbed as if there were a flaw in my own breast, and it were in danger of bursting. The counting-house clock was at 12:30, and there was general preparation for going to dinner, when Mr. Quinion tapped at the counting-house window, and beckoned me to go in. I went in, and found there a stoutish middle-aged person, in a brown surtout and black tights and shoes, with no more hair upon his head, which was a large one and very shining, than there is upon an egg, and with a very extensive face, which he turned full upon me. His clothes were shabby, but he had an imposing shirt collar on. He carried a jaunty sort of a stick with a large pair of rusty tassels to it, and a quizzing glass hung outside his coat, for ornament I afterwards found, as he very seldom looked through it, and couldn't see anything when he did. "This," said Mr. Quinion, in allusion to myself, "is he." "This," said the stranger, with a certain condescending roll in his voice, and a certain indescribable air of doing something genteel, which impressed me very much, "is Master Copperfield." "I hope I see you well, sir." I said I was very well, and I hoped he was. I was sufficiently ill at ease, heaven knows, but it was not in my nature to complain much at that time of my life, so I said I was very well, and hoped he was. "I am," said the stranger, "thank heaven, quite well. I have received a letter from Mr. Murdstone, in which he mentions that he would desire me to receive into an apartment at the rear of my house, which is at present unoccupied, and is, in short, to be let as, in short," said the stranger with a smile and a burst of confidence, "as a bedroom, the young beginner whom I now have the pleasure to," and the stranger waved his hand and settled his chin in his shirt collar. "This is Mr. Micawber," said Mr. Quinion to me. "Ahem," said the stranger, "that is my name." "Mr. Micawber," said Mr. Quinion, "is known to Mr. Murdstone. He takes orders for us on occasion, when he can get any, and he has been written to by Mr. Murdstone on the subject of your lodgings, and he will receive you as a lodger." "My address," said Mr. Micawber, "is Windsor, Terrace, City Road. In short," said Mr. Micawber with the same genteel air, and in another burst of confidence, "I live there." I made him a bow. "Under the impression," said Mr. Micawber, "that your peregrinations in this metropolis have not as yet been extensive, and that you might have some difficulty in penetrating the arcana of the modern Babylon in the direction of the City Road, in short," said Mr. Micawber in another burst of confidence, "you might lose yourself, I shall be happy to call this evening, and install you in the knowledge of the nearest way." I thanked him with all my heart, for it was friendly of him to offer to take the trouble. "At what hour," said Mr. Micawber, "shall I—" "At about 8, said Mr. Quinion. "At about 8, said Mr. Micawber. "I beg to wish you good day, Mr. Quinion. I will intrude no longer." He put on his hat, and went out with his cane under his arm, very upright, and humming a tune, when he was clear of the counting house. Mr. Quinion then formally engaged me to be as useful as I could in the warehouse of Murdstone and Grinby, at a salary, I think, of 6 shillings a week. I am not clear whether it was 6 or 7. I am inclined to believe, from my uncertainty on this head, that it was 6 at first, and 7 afterwards. He paid me a week down, from his own pocket I believe, and I gave Mealy 6pence out of it to get my trunk carried to Windsor Terrace that night, it being too heavy for my strength, small as it was. I paid 6pence more for my dinner, which was a meat pie and a turn at a neighbouring pump, and passed the hour which was allowed for that meal in walking about the streets. At the appointed time in the evening, Mr. Micawber reappeared. I washed my hands and face, to do the greater honour to his gentility, and we walked to our house, as I suppose I must call it now, together. Mr. Micawber impressing the name of the streets and the shapes of corner houses upon me as we went along, that I might find my way back easily in the morning. Arrived at this house in Windsor Terrace, which I noticed was shabby like himself, but also like himself made all the show it could, he presented me to Mrs. Micawber, a thin and faded lady, not at all young, who was sitting in the parlour. The first floor was altogether unfurnished, and the blinds were kept down to delude the neighbours, with a baby at her breast. This baby was one of twins, and I may remark here that I hardly ever, in all my experience of the family, saw both twins detached from Mrs. Micawber at the same time. One of them was always taking refreshment. There were 2 other children, Master Micawber, aged about 4, and Miss Micawber, aged about 3. These and a dark-complexioned young woman, with a habit of snorting, who was a servant in the family, and informed me, before half an hour had expired, that she was a orfling, and came from St. Luke's workhouse in the neighbourhood, completed the establishment. My room was at the top of the house, at the back. a close chamber, stencilled all over with an ornament which my young imagination represented as a blue muffin, and very scantily furnished. "I never thought," said Mrs. Micawber, when she came up, twin and all, to show me the apartment, and sat down to take breath, "before I was married, when I lived with papa and mamma, that I should ever find it necessary to take a lodger. But Mr. Micawber being in difficulties, all considerations of private feelings must give way." I said, "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Micawber's difficulties are almost overwhelming just at present," said Mrs. Micawber, "and whether it is possible to bring him through them, I don't know. When I lived at home with papa and mamma, I really should have hardly understood what the word meant, in the sense in which I now employ it, but experientia does it, as papa used to say." I could not satisfy myself whether she told me that Mr. Micawber had been an officer in the marines, or whether I have imagined it. I only know that I believe to this hour that he was in the marines once upon a time, without knowing why. He was a sort of town traveller for a number of miscellaneous houses now, but made little or nothing of it, I am afraid. "If Mr. Micawber's creditors will not give him time," said Mrs. Micawber, "they must take the consequences, and the sooner they bring it to an issue the better. Blood cannot be obtained from a stone, neither can anything on account be obtained at present, not to mention law expenses, from Mr. Micawber." I cannot quite understand whether my precocious self-dependence confused Mrs. Micawber in reference to my age, or whether she was so full of the subject that she would have talked about it to the very twins if there had been nobody else to communicate with, but this was the strain in which she began, and she went on accordingly all the time I knew her. Poor Mrs. Micawber! She said she had tried to exert herself, and so I have no doubt she had. The centre of the street door was perfectly covered with a great brass plate, on which was engraved Mrs. Micawber's boarding establishment for young ladies, but I never found that any young lady had ever been to school there, or that any young lady ever came, or proposed to come, or that the least preparation was ever made to receive any young lady. The only visitor I ever saw, or heard of, were creditors. They used to come at all hours, and some of them were quite ferocious. One dirty-faced man, I think he was a bootmaker, used to edge himself into the passage as early as 7 o'clock in the morning, and call up the stairs to Mr. Micawber, "Come, you ain't out yet, you know. Pay us, will you? Don't hide, you know, that's mean. I wouldn't be mean if I was you. Pay us, will you? Just pay us, do you hear? Come." Receiving no answer to these taunts, he would mount in his wrath to the words "swindlers" and "robbers," and these being ineffectual too, would sometimes go to the extremity of crossing the street and roaring up at the windows of the second floor, where he knew Mr. Micawber was. At these times Mr. Micawber would be transported with grief and mortification, even to the length, as I was once made aware by a scream from his wife, of making motions at himself with a razor. But within half an hour afterwards he would polish up his shoes with extraordinary pains, and go out, humming a tune, with a greater air of gentility than ever. Mrs. Micawber was quite as elastic. I have known her to be thrown into fainting fits by the king's taxes at 3 o'clock, and to eat lamb chops, breaded, and drink warm ale, paid for with 2 teaspoons that had gone to the pawnbrokers, at 4. On one occasion, when an execution had just been put in, coming home through some chance as early as 6 o'clock, I saw her lying, of course with a twin, under the grate in a swoon, with her hair all torn about her face, but I never knew her more cheerful than she was that very same night over a veal cutlet before the kitchen fire, telling me stories about her papa and mamma, and the company they used to keep. In this house and with this family I passed my leisure time. My own exclusive breakfast of a penny loaf and a pennyworth of milk I provided myself. I kept another small loaf and a modicum of cheese on a particular shelf of a particular cupboard, to make my supper on when I came back at night. This made a hole in the 6 or 7 shillings, I know well, and I was out at the warehouse all day, and had to support myself on that money all the week. From Monday morning until Saturday night I had no advice, no counsel, no encouragement, no consolation, no assistance, no support of any kind from any one that I can call to mind, as I hope to go to heaven. I was so young and childish, and so little qualified, how could I be otherwise, to undertake the whole charge of my own existence, that often in going to Murdstone and Grinby's of a morning, I could not resist the stale pastry put out for sale at half price at the pastry cook's doors, and spent in that the money I should have kept for my dinner. Then I went without my dinner, or bought a roll or a slice of pudding. I remember 2 pudding shops, between which I was divided according to my finances. One was in a sort of court close to St. Martin's Church, at the back of the church, which is now removed altogether. The pudding at that shop was made of currants, and was rather a special pudding, but it was dear, 2 pennyworth not being larger than a pennyworth of more ordinary pudding. A good shop for the latter was in the Strand, somewhere in that part which has been rebuilt since. There was a stout pale pudding, heavy and flabby, and with great flat raisins in it, stuck in whole at wide distances apart. It came up hot at about my time every day, and many a day did I dine off it. When I dined regularly and handsomely, I had a saveloy and a penny loaf, or a 4 penny plate of red beef from a cook's shop, or a plate of bread and cheese and a glass of beer from a miserable old public house opposite our place of business, called the Lion, or the Lion and something else that I have forgotten. Once I remember carrying my own bread, which I had brought from home in the morning, under my arm, wrapped in a piece of paper like a book, and going to a famous Alamode beef house near Drury Lane, and ordering a small plate of that delicacy to eat with it. What the waiter thought of such a strange little apparition coming in all alone I don't know, but I can see him now, staring at me as I ate my dinner, and bringing up the other waiter to look. I gave him a 1/2 for himself, and wish he hadn't taken it. We had half an hour, I think, for tea. When I had money enough, I used to get a 1/2 pint of ready-made coffee and a slice of bread and butter. When I had none, I used to look at a venison shop in Fleet Street, or I have strolled at such a time as far as Covent Garden Market, and stared at the pineapples. I was fond of wandering about the Adelphi, because it was a mysterious place with those dark arches. I see myself emerging one evening from one of these arches on a little public house close to the river, with an open space before it, where some coal heavers were dancing, to look at whom I sat down upon a bench. I wonder what they thought of me. I was such a child, and so little, that frequently when I went into the bar of a strange public house for a glass of ale or porter, to moisten what I had had for dinner, they were afraid to give it to me. I remember one hot evening I went into the bar of a public house, and said to the landlord, "What is your very best ale a glass?" For it was a special occasion, I don't know what. It may have been my birthday. "Twopence 1/2", said the landlord, "is the price of the genuine stunning ale." "Then," says I, producing the money, "just draw me a glass of the genuine stunning, if you please, with a good head to it." The landlord looked at me in return over the bar from head to foot, with a strange smile on his face, and instead of drawing the beer, looked round the screen, and said something to his wife. She came out from behind it with her work in her hand, and joined him in surveying me. Here we stand, all 3, before me now, the landlord in his shirt sleeves, leaning against the bar window frame, his wife looking over the little half door, and I in some confusion looking up at them from outside the partition. They asked me a good many questions, as what my name was, how old I was, where I lived, how I was employed, and how I came there. To all of which, that I might commit nobody, I invented, I am afraid, appropriate answers. They served me with the ale, though I expected it was not the genuine stunning, and the landlord's wife, opening the little half door of the bar and bending down, gave me my money back, and gave me a kiss that was half admiring and half compassionate, but all womanly and good, I am sure. I know I do not exaggerate unconsciously and unintentionally the scantiness of my resources or the difficulties of my life. I know that if a shilling were given me by Mr. Quinion at any time, I spent it in a dinner or a tea. I know that I worked from morning until night with common men and boys, a shabby child. I know that I lounged about the streets insufficiently and unsatisfactorily fed. I know that but for the mercy of God I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a little vagabond. Yet I held some station at Murdstone and Grinby's too. Besides that Mr. Quinion did what a careless man so occupied, and dealing with a thing so anomalous could, to treat me as one upon a different footing from the rest, I never said, to man or boy, how it was that I came to be there, or gave the least indication of being sorry that I was there. That I suffered in secret, and that I suffered exquisitely, no one ever knew but I. How much I suffered it is, as I have already said, utterly beyond my power to tell. But I kept my own counsel, and I did my work. I knew from the first that if I could not do my work as well as any of the rest, I could not hold myself above slight and contempt. I soon became at least as expeditious and as skilful as either of the other boys. Though perfectly familiar with them, my conduct and manner were different enough from theirs to place a space between us, and the men generally spoke of me as the little gent, or the little suffolker. A certain man named Gregory, who was foreman of the packers, and another named Tip, who was a carman and wore a red jacket, used to address me sometimes as David, but I think it was mostly when we were very confidential, and when I had made some efforts to entertain them, over our work, with some results of the old readings, which were fast perishing out of my remembrance. Mealy Potatoes uprose once, and rebelled against my being so distinguished, but Mick Walker settled him in no time. My rescue from this kind of existence I considered quite hopeless, and abandoned as such altogether. I am solemnly convinced that I never for 1 hour was reconciled to it, or was otherwise than miserably unhappy, but I bore it, and even to Peggotty, partly for the love of her and partly for shame, never in any letter, though many passed between us, revealed the truth. Mr. Micawber's difficulties were an addition to the distressed state of my mind. In my forlorn state I became quite attached to the family, and used to walk about, busy with Mrs. Micawber's calculations of ways and means, and heavy with the weight of Mr. Micawber's debts. On a Saturday night, which was my grand treat, partly because it was a great thing to walk home with 6 or 7 shillings in my pocket, looking into the shops and thinking what such a sum would buy, and partly because I went home early, Mrs. Micawber would make the most heart-rending confidences to me. Also on a Sunday, when I mixed the portion of tea or coffee I had bought overnight in a little shaving pot, and sat late at my breakfast. It was nothing at all unusual for Mr. Micawber to sob violently at the beginning of one of these Saturday night conversations, and sing about Jack's delight being his lovely Nan towards the end of it. I have known him to come home to supper with a flood of tears, and a declaration that nothing was now left but jail, and to go to bed making a calculation of the expense of putting bow windows to the house, in case anything turned up, which was his favourite expression, and Mrs. Micawber was just the same. A curious equality of friendship, originating I suppose in our respective circumstances, sprung up between me and these people, notwithstanding the ludicrous disparity of our years. But I never allowed myself to be prevailed upon to accept any invitation to eat and drink with them out of their stock, knowing that they got on badly with the butcher and baker, and had often not too much for themselves, until Mrs. Micawber took me into her entire confidence. This she did one evening as follows. "Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "I make no stranger of you, and therefore do not hesitate to say that Mr. Micawber's difficulties are coming to a crisis." It made me very miserable to hear it, and I looked at Mrs. Micawber's red eyes with the utmost sympathy. "With the exception of the heel of a Dutch cheese, which is not adapted to the wants of a young family," said Mrs. Micawber, "there is really not a scrap of anything in the larder. I was accustomed to speak of the larder when I lived with papa and mamma, and I use the word almost unconsciously. What I mean to express is, that there is nothing to eat in the house." "Dear me," I said in great concern. I had 2 or 3 shillings of my week's money in my pocket, from which I presume that it must have been on a Wednesday night when we held this conversation, and I hastily produced them, and with heartfelt emotion begged Mrs. Micawber to accept them as a loan. But that lady, kissing me and making me put them back in my pocket, replied that she couldn't think of it. "No, my dear Master Copperfield," said she, "far be it from my thoughts, but you have a discretion beyond your years, and can render me another kind of service if you will, and a service I will thankfully accept of." I begged Mrs. Micawber to name it. "I have parted with the plate myself," said Mrs. Micawber. 6 tea, 2 salt, and a pair of sugars, I have at different times borrowed money on in secret with my own hands. But the twins are a great tie, and to me, with my recollections of papa and mamma, these transactions are very painful. There are still a few trifles that we could part with. Mr. Micawber's feelings would never allow him to dispose of them, and Clickett," this was the girl from the workhouse, "being of a vulgar mind, would take painful liberties if such a confidence was reposed in her. Master Copperfield, if I might ask you—" I understood Mrs. Micawber now, and begged her to make use of me to any extent. I began to dispose of the more portable articles of property that very evening, and went out on a similar expedition almost every morning before I went to Murdstone and Grinby's. Mr. Micawber had a few books on a little chiffonier, which he called the library, and those went first. I carried them, one after another, to the bookstall in the City Road, one part of which, near our house, was almost all bookstalls and bird shops then, and sold them for whatever they would bring. The keeper of this bookstall, who lived in a little house behind it, used to get tipsy every night, and to be violently scolded by his wife every morning. More than once, when I went there early, I had audience of him in a turn-up bedstead, with a cut in his forehead or a black eye, bearing witness to his excesses overnight. I am afraid he was quarrelsome in his drink, and he, with a shaking hand, endeavouring to find the needful shillings in one or other of the pockets of his clothes, which lay upon the floor, while his wife, with a baby in her arms and her shoes down at heel, never left off rating him. Sometimes he had lost his money, and then he would ask me to call again, but his wife had always got some, had taken his, I dare say, while he was drunk, and secretly completed the bargain on the stairs as we went down together. At the pawnbroker's shop, too, I became very well known. The principal gentleman who officiated behind the counter took a good deal of notice of me, and often got me, I recollect, to decline a Latin noun or adjective, or to conjugate a Latin verb in his ear while he transacted my business. After all these occasions, Mrs. Micawber made a little treat, which was generally a supper, and there was a peculiar relish in these meals which I well remember. At last Mr. Micawber's difficulties came to a crisis, and he was arrested early one morning, and carried over to the King's Bench prison in the Borough. He told me, as he went out of the house, that the god of the day had now gone down upon him, and I really thought his heart was broken, and mine too. But I heard afterwards that he was seen to play a lively game at skittles before noon. On the first Sunday after he was taken there, I was to go to see him, and have dinner with him. I was to ask my way to such a place, and just short of that place I should see such another place, and just short of that I should see a yard which I was to cross, and keep straight on until I saw a turnkey. All this I did, and when at last I did see a turnkey, poor little fellow that I was, I thought how, when Roderick Random was in a debtor's prison, there was a man there with nothing on him but an old rug. The turnkey swam before my dimmed eyes and my beating heart. Mr. Micawber was waiting for me within the gate, and we went up to his room, top story but one, and cried very much. He solemnly conjured me, I remember, to take warning by his fate, and to observe, that if a man had £20 a year for his income, and spent £19 19 shillings and sixpence, he would be happy, but that if he spent £20 one, he would be miserable. After which he borrowed a shilling from me for porter, and gave me a written order on Mrs. Micawber for the amount, and put away his pocket handkerchief and cheered up. We sat before a little fire, with 2 bricks put within the rusted grate, one on each side, to prevent its burning too many coals, until another debtor, who shared the room with Mr. Micawber, came in from the bakehouse with a loin of mutton, which was our joint stock repast. Then I was sent up to Captain Hopkins, in the room overhead, with Mr. Micawber's compliments, and I was his young friend, and would Captain Hopkins lend me a knife and fork. Captain Hopkins lent me the knife and fork, with his compliments to Mr. Micawber. There was a very dirty lady in this room, and 2 wan girls, his daughters, with shock heads of hair. I thought it was better to borrow Captain Hopkins' knife and fork than Captain Hopkins' comb. The captain himself was in the last extremity of shabbiness, with large whiskers, and an old brown greatcoat, with no other coat below it. I saw his bed rolled up in a corner, and what plates and dishes and pots he had on a shelf, and I divined, God knows how, that though the 2 girls with the shock heads of hair were Captain Hopkins' children, the dirty lady was not married to Captain Hopkins. My timid station on this threshold was not occupied more than a couple of minutes at most, but I came down again with all this in my knowledge, as surely as the knife and fork were in my hand. There was something gipsy-like and agreeable in the dinner after all. I took back Captain Hopkins's knife and fork early in the afternoon, and went home to comfort Mrs. Micawber with an account of my visit. She fainted when she saw me return, and made a little jug of egg hot afterwards to console us while we talked it over. I don't know how the household furniture came to be sold for the family benefit, or who sold it, except that I did not. Sold it was, however, and carried away in a van, except the bed, a few chairs, and the kitchen table. With these possessions we encamped, as it were, in the 2 parlours of the emptied house in Windsor Terrace, Mrs. Micawber, the children, the orpling, and myself, and lived in those rooms night and day. I had no idea for how long, though it seems to me for a long time. At last Mrs. Micawber resolved to move into the prison, where Mr. Micawber had now secured a room to himself. So I took the key of the house to the landlord, who was very glad to get it, and the beds were sent over to the King's Bench, except mine, for which a little room was hired outside the walls in the neighbourhood of that institution, very much to my satisfaction, since the Micawbers and I had become too used to one another in our troubles to part. The orpling was likewise accommodated with an inexpensive lodging in the same neighbourhood. Mine was a quiet back garret with a sloping roof commanding a pleasant prospect of a timber yard, and when I took possession of it, with the reflection that Mr. Micawber's troubles had come to a crisis at last, I thought it quite a paradise. All this time I was working at Murdstone and Grinby's in the same common way, and with the same common companions, and with the same sense of unmerited degradation as at first. But I never, happily for me no doubt, made a single acquaintance, or spoke to any of the many boys whom I saw daily in going to the warehouse, in coming from it, and in prowling about the streets at meal times. I led the same secretly unhappy life, but I led it in the same lonely self-reliant manner. The only changes I am conscious of are, firstly, that I had grown more shabby, and secondly, that I was now relieved of much of the weight of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber's cares, for some relatives or friends had engaged to help them at their present pass, and they lived more comfortably in the prison than they had lived for a long while out of it. I used to go to breakfast with them now, in virtue of some arrangement, of which I have forgotten the details. I forget too at what hour the gates were opened in the morning, admitting of my going in, but I know that I was often up at 6 o'clock, and that my favourite lounging place in the interval was old London Bridge, where I was wont to sit in one of the stone recesses, watching the people go by, or to look over the balustrades at the sun shining in the water, and lighting up the golden flame on top of the monument. The orpling met me there sometimes, to be told some astonishing fictions respecting the wharfs and the tower, of which I can say no more than that I hoped I believed them myself. In the evening I used to go back to the prison, and walk up and down the parade with Mr. Micawber, or play casino with Mrs. Micawber, and hear reminiscences of her papa and mamma. Whether Mr. Murdstone knew where I was, I am unable to say. I never told them at Murdstone and Grinby's. Mr. Micawber's affairs, though past their crisis, were very much involved by reason of a certain deed, of which I used to hear a great deal, and which I suppose now to have been some former composition with his creditors, though I was so far from being clear about it then, that I am conscious of having confounded it with those demoniacal parchments which are held to have upon a time obtained to a great extent in Germany. At last this document appeared to be got out of the way somehow. At all events it ceased to be the rock ahead it had been, and Mrs. Micawber informed me that her family had decided that Mr. Micawber should apply for his release under the Insolvent Debtors Act, which would set him free, she expected, in about 6 weeks. "And then," said Mr. Micawber, who was present, "I have no doubt I shall, please heaven, begin to be beforehand with the world, and to live in a perfectly new manner, if, in short, anything turns up." By way of going in for anything that might be on the cards, I called to mind that Mr. Micawber about this time composed a petition to the House of Commons, praying for an alteration in the law of imprisonment for debt. I set down this remembrance here, because it is an instance to myself of the manner in which I fitted my old books to my altered life, and made stories for myself out of the streets, and out of men and women, and how some main points in the character I shall unconsciously develop, I suppose, in writing my life, were gradually forming all this while. There was a club in the prison in which Mr. Micawber was a gentleman, was a great authority. Mr. Micawber had stated his idea of the petition to the club, and the club had strongly approved of the same. Wherefore Mr. Micawber, who was a thoroughly good-natured man, and as active a creature about everything but his own affairs as ever existed, and never so happy as when he was busy about something that could never be of any profit to him, set to work at the petition, invented it, engrossed it on an immense sheet of paper, spread it out on a table, and appointed a time for all at the club, and all within the walls if they chose, to come up to his room and sign it. When I heard of this approaching ceremony, I was so anxious to see them all come in, one after another, though I knew the greater part of them already, and they me, that I got an hour's leave of absence from Murdstone and Grinby's, and established myself in a corner for that purpose. As many of the principal members of the club as could be got into the small room without filling it, supported Mr. Micawber in front of the petition, while my old friend Captain Hopkins, who had washed himself to do honour to so solemn an occasion, stationed himself close by it, to read it to all who were unacquainted with its contents. The door was then thrown open, and the general population began to come in a long file, several waiting outside while one entered, affixed his signature, and went out. To everybody in succession, Captain Hopkins said, "Have you read it? No? Would you like to hear it read?" If he weakly showed the least disposition to hear it, Captain Hopkins, in a loud sonorous voice, gave him every word of it. The captain would have read it 20,000 times, if 20,000 people would have heard him, one by one. I remember a certain luscious roll he gave to such phrases as, "The people's representatives in Parliament assembled," "The petitioners herefore humbly approach your honourable house," "His Majesty's gracious unfortunate subjects," as if the words were something real in his mouth, and delicious to taste. Mr. Micawber meanwhile listening with a little of the author's vanity, and contemplating, not severely, the spikes on the wall opposite. As I walked to and fro daily between Southwark and Blackfriars, and lounged about at meal times in obscure streets, the stones of which may, for anything I know, be worn at this moment by my childish feet, I wonder how many of these people were waiting in the crowd that used to come filing before me in review again, to the echo of Captain Hopkins's voice. When my thoughts go back now to that slow agony of youth, I wonder how much of the history I invented for such people hangs like a mist of fancy over well-remembered facts. When I tread the old ground, do I not wonder that I seem to see and pity going on before me an innocent romantic boy, making his imaginative world out of such strange experiences and sordid things. End of chapter 11. Of David Copperfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by T.Hynes. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Chapter 12. Liking life on my own account no better, I form a great resolution. In due time Mr. Micawber's petition was ripe for hearing, and that gentleman was ordered to be discharged under the Act, to my great joy. His creditors were not implacable, and Mrs. Micawber informed me that even the revengeful bootmaker had declared in open court that he bore him no malice, but that when money was owing to him he liked to be paid. He said he thought it was human nature. Mr. Micawber returned to the King's Bench when his case was over, as some fees were to be settled, and some formalities observed, before he could be actually released. The club received him with transport, and held a harmonic meeting that evening in his honour, while Mrs. Micawber and I had a lamb's fry in private, surrounded by the sleeping family. "On such an occasion I will give you, Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, in a little more flip, for we had been having some already, "the memory of my papa and mamma." "Are they dead, ma'am?" I inquired, after drinking the toast in a wine glass. "My mamma departed this life," said Mrs. Micawber, "before Mr. Micawber's difficulties commenced, or at least before they became pressing. My papa lived to bail Mr. Micawber several times, and then expired, regretted by a numerous circle." Mrs. Micawber shook her head, and dropped a pious tear upon the twin who happened to be in hand. As I could hardly hope for a more favourable opportunity of putting a question in which I had a near interest, I said to Mrs. Micawber, "May I ask, ma'am, what you and Mr. Micawber intend to do, now that Mr. Micawber is out of difficulties and at liberty? Have you settled yet?" "My family," said Mrs. Micawber, who always said those two words with an air, though I never could discover who came under the denomination. My family are of opinion that Mr. Micawber should quit London, and exert his talents in the country. Mr. Micawber is a man of great talent, Master Copperfield. I said I was sure of that. Of great talent, repeated Mrs. Micawber. My family are of opinion that, with a little interest, something might be done for a man of his ability in the custom house. The influence of my family being local, it is their wish that Mr. Micawber should go down to Plymouth. They think it indispensable that he should be on the spot. That he may be ready, I suggested. Exactly, returned Mrs. Micawber, that he may be ready, in case of anything turning up. And do you go too, ma'am? The events of the day, in combination with the twins, if not with the flip, made Mrs. Micawber hysterical, and she shed tears as she replied, I never will desert Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber may have concealed his difficulties from me in the first instance, but his sanguine temper may have led him to expect that he would overcome them. The pearl necklace and bracelets which I inherited from mamma have been disposed of for less than half their value, and the set of coral, which was the wedding gift of my papa, has been actually thrown away for nothing. But I never will desert Mr. Micawber. No, cries Mrs. Micawber, more affected than before. I never will do it. It's of no use asking me. I felt quite uncomfortable, as if Mrs. Micawber supposed I had asked her to do anything of the sort, and sat looking at her in alarm. Mr. Micawber has his faults. I do not deny that he is improvident. I do not deny that he has kept me in the dark as to his resources and his liabilities both, she went on, looking at the wall. But I never will desert Mr. Micawber. Mrs. Micawber having now raised her voice to a perfect scream, I was so frightened that I ran off to the club room, and disturbed Mr. Micawber in the act of presiding at a long table, and leading the chorus of Gee up, Dobbin, gee ho, Dobbin, gee up, Dobbin, gee up and gee ho, with the tidings that Mrs. Micawber was in an alarming state, upon which he immediately burst into tears, and came away with me with his waistcoat full of the heads and tails of shrimps, of which he had been partaking. Emma, my angel, cried Mr. Micawber, running into the room, what is the matter? I never will desert you, Micawber, she exclaimed. My life, said Mr. Micawber, taking her in his arms, I am perfectly aware of it. He is the parent of my children. He is the father of my twins. He is the husband of my affections, cried Mrs. Micawber, struggling, and I never will desert Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber was so deeply affected by this proof of her devotion, as to me I was dissolved in tears, that he hung over her in a passionate manner, imploring her to look up and be calm. But the more he asked Mrs. Micawber to look up, the more she fixed her eyes on nothing, and the more he asked her to compose herself, the more she wouldn't. Consequently, Mr. Micawber was soon so overcome that he mingled his tears with hers and mine, until he begged me to do him the favour of taking a chair on the staircase while he got her into bed. I would have taken my leave for the night, but he would not hear of my doing that until the stranger's bell should ring. So I sat at the staircase window until he came out with another chair and joined me. How is Mrs. Micawber now, sir? I said. Very low, said Mr. Micawber, shaking his head. Reaction. Ah, this has been a dreadful day. We stand alone now. Everything is gone from us. Mr. Micawber pressed my hand and groaned, and afterwards shed tears. I was greatly touched, and disappointed too, for I had expected that we should be quite gay on this happy and long-looked-for occasion. But Mr. and Mrs. Micawber were so used to their old difficulties, I think that they felt quite shipwrecked when they came to consider that they were released from them. All their elasticity was departed, and I never saw them half so wretched as on this night, insomuch that when the bell rang, and Mr. Micawber walked with me to the lodge, and parted from me there with a blessing, I felt quite afraid to leave him by himself, he was so profoundly miserable. But through all the confusion and lowness of spirits in which we had been, so unexpectedly to me, involved, I plainly discerned that Mr. and Mrs. Micawber and their family were going away from London, and that a parting between us was near at hand. It was in my walk home that night, and in the sleepless hours which followed when I lay in bed, that the thought first occurred to me, though I don't know how it came into my head, which afterwards shaped itself into a settled resolution. I had grown to be so accustomed to the Micawbers, and had been so intimate with them in their distress, and was so utterly friendless without them, that the prospect of being thrown upon some new shift for a lodging, and going once more among unknown people, was like being that moment turned adrift into my present life, with such knowledge of it ready made as experience had given me. All the sensitive feelings it wounded so cruelly, all the shame and misery it kept alive within my breast, became more poignant as I thought of this, and I determined that the life was unendurable. That there was no hope of escape from it unless the escape was of my own act, I knew quite well. I rarely heard from Miss Murdstone, and never from Mr. Murdstone, but 2 or 3 parcels of made or mended clothes had come up for me, consigned to Mr. Quinion, and in each there was a scrap of paper to the effect that J.M. trusted D.C. was applying himself to business, and devoting himself wholly to his duties, not the least hint of my ever being anything else than the common drudge into which I was fast settling down. The very next day showed me, while my mind was in the first agitation of what it had conceived, that Mrs. Micawber had not spoken of their going away without warrant. They took a lodging in the house where I lived for a week, at the expiration of which time they were to start for Plymouth. Mr. Micawber himself came down to the counting house in the afternoon, to tell Mr. Quinion that he must relinquish me on the day of his departure, and to give me a high character, which I am sure I deserved. And Mr. Quinion, calling in Tip the carman, who was a married man, and had a room to let, quartered me prospectively on him, by our mutual consent, as he had every reason to think, for I said nothing, though my resolution was now taken. I passed my evenings with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber during the remaining term of our residence under the same roof, and I think we became fonder of one another as time went on. On the last Sunday they invited me to dinner, and we had a loin of pork and apple sauce, and a pudding. I had bought a spotted wooden horse overnight as a parting gift to little Wilkins Micawber, that was the boy, and a doll for little Emma. I had also bestowed a shilling on the orphan, who was about to be disbanded. We had a very pleasant day, though we were all in a tender state about our approaching separation. "I shall never, Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber, "revert to the period when Mr. Micawber was in difficulties, without thinking of you. Your conduct has always been of the most delicate and obliging description. You have never been a lodger, you have been a friend." "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "Copperfield," for so he had been accustomed to call me of late, "has a heart to feel for the distress of his fellow creatures, when they are behind a cloud, and a head to plan, and a hand to, in short, a general ability to dispose of such available property as could be made away with." I expressed my sense of this commendation, and said I was very sorry we were going to lose one another. "My dear young friend," said Mr. Micawber, "I am older than you, a man of some experience in life, and of some experience, in short, in difficulties, generally speaking. At present, and until something turns up, which I am, I may say, hourly expecting, I have nothing to bestow but advice. Still my advice is so far worth taking that, in short, that I have never taken it myself, and am the—" Here Mr. Micawber, who had been beaming and smiling all over his head and face up to the present moment, checked himself and frowned. "The miserable wretch you behold." "My dear Micawber," urged his wife. "I say," returned Mr. Micawber, quite forgetting himself and smiling again, "the miserable wretch you behold. My advice is, never do tomorrow what you can do today. Procrastination is the thief of time. Collar him." "My poor papa's maxim," Mrs. Micawber observed. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "your papa was very well in his way, and heaven forbid that I should disparage him. Take him for all in all. We ne'er shall, in short, make the acquaintance probably of anybody else possessing, at his time of life, the same legs for gaiters, and able to read the same description of print without spectacles. But he applied that maxim to our marriage, my dear, and that was so far prematurely entered into, in consequence, that I never recovered the expense.' Mr. Micawber looked aside at Mrs. Micawber, and added, 'Not that I am sorry for it. Quite the contrary, my love.' After which he was grave for a minute or so. 'My other piece of advice, Copperfield,' said Mr. Micawber. 'You know. Annual income £20, annual expenditure 19, 19 and 6. Result, happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20 ought and 6. Result, misery. The blossom is blighted, the leaf is withered, the god of day goes down upon the dreary scene, and, in short, you are forever floored, as I am.' To make his example the more impressive, Mr. Micawber drank a glass of punch with an air of great enjoyment and satisfaction, and whistled the college hornpipe. I did not fail to assure him that I would store these precepts in my mind, though indeed I had no need to do so, for at that time they affected me visibly. Next morning I met the whole family at the coach office, and saw them with a desolate heart take their places outside at the back. 'Master Copperfield,' said Mrs. Micawber, 'God bless you. I never can forget all that, you know, and I never would if I could.' 'Copperfield,' said Mr. Micawber, 'farewell. Every happiness and prosperity. If, in the progress of revolving years, I could persuade myself that my blighted destiny has been a warning to you, I should feel that I had not occupied another man's place in existence altogether in vain. In case of anything turning up, of which I am rather confident, I shall be extremely happy if it should be in my power to improve your prospects.' I think as Mrs. Micawber sat at the back of the coach with the children, and I stood in the road looking wistfully at them, a mist cleared from her eyes, and she saw what a little creature I really was. I think so because she beckoned to me to climb up, with quite a new and motherly expression in her face, and put her arm round my neck, and gave me just such a kiss as she might have given to her own boy. I had barely time to get down again before the coach started, and I could hardly see the family for the handkerchiefs they waved. It was gone in a minute. The orphan and I stood looking vacantly at each other in the middle of the road, and then shook hands and said good-bye, she going back, I suppose, to St. Luke's workhouse, as I went to begin my weary day at Murdstone's and Grinby's. But with no intention of passing many more weary days there. No, I had resolved to run away, to go by some means or other down to the country, to the only relation I had in the world, and tell my story to my aunt, Miss Betsey. I have already observed that I don't know how this desperate idea came into my brain, but once there, it remained there, and hardened into a purpose than which I have never entertained a more determined purpose in my life. I am far from sure that I believed there was anything hopeful in it, but my mind was so thoroughly made up that it must be carried to execution. Again and again, and 100 times again, since the night when the thought had first occurred to me and banished sleep, I had gone over that old story of my poor mother's about my birth, which it had been one of my great delights in the old time to hear her tell, and which I knew by heart. My aunt walked into that story, and walked out of it a dread and awful personage. But there was one little trait in her behaviour which I liked to dwell on, and which gave me some faint shadow of encouragement. I could not forget how my mother had thought that she had felt her touch her pretty hair with no ungentle hand, and though it might have been altogether my mother's fancy, and might have had no foundation whatever in fact, I made a little picture out of it, of my terrible aunt relenting towards the girlish beauty that I recollected so well and loved so much, which softened the whole narrative. It is very possible that it had been in my mind a long time, and had gradually engendered my determination. As I did not know even where Miss Betsey lived, I wrote a long letter to Peggotty, and asked her, incidentally, if she remembered, pretending that I had heard of such a lady living at a certain place I named at random, and had a curiosity to know if it were the same. In the course of that letter I told Peggotty that I had a particular occasion for half a guinea, and that if she could lend me that sum until I could repay it, I should be very much obliged to her, and would tell her afterwards what I wanted it for.
Peggotty's answer soon arrived, and was, as usual, full of affectionate devotion. She enclosed the half-guinea. I was afraid she must have had a world of trouble to get it out of Mr. Barkis's box, and told me that Miss Betsey lived near Dover, but whether at Dover herself, at Hythe, Sandgate, or Folkestone, she could not say. One of our men, however, informing me on my asking him about these places that they were all close together, I deemed this enough for my object, and resolved to set out at the end of that week. Being a very honest little creature, and unwilling to disgrace the memory I was going to leave behind me at Murdstone and Grinby's, I considered myself bound to remain until Saturday night, and as I had been paid a week's wages in advance when I first came there, not to present myself in the counting house at the usual hour to receive my stipend. For this express reason I had borrowed the half-guinea, that I might not be without a fund for my travelling expenses. Accordingly, when the Saturday night came, and we were all waiting in the warehouse to be paid, and Tip the carman, who always took precedence, went in first to draw his money, I shook Micawber by the hand, asked him when it came to his turn to be paid, to say to Mr. Quinion that I had gone to move my box to Tip's, and bidding a last good night to mealy potatoes, ran away. My box was at my old lodgings over the water, and I had written a direction for it on the back of one of our address cards that we nailed on the casks. Master David, to be left till called for, at the coach office, Dover. This I had in my pocket ready to put on the box, after I should have got it out of the house, and as I went towards my lodgings, I looked about me for someone who would help me carry it to the booking office. There was a long-legged young man with a very little empty donkey-cart standing near the obelisk in the Blackfriars road, whose eyes I caught as I was going by, and who, addressing me as "Sixpenn'orth of bad halfpence," hoped I should know him again to swear to, in allusion I have no doubt to my staring at him. I stopped to assure him that I had not done so in bad manners, but uncertain whether he might or might not like a job. "What job?" said the long-legged young man. "To move a box," I answered. "What box?" said the long-legged young man. I told him mine, which was down that street there, and which I wanted him to take to the Dover coach office for sixpence. "Done with you for a tanner," said the long-legged young man, and directly got upon his cart, which was nothing but a large wooden tray on wheels, and rattled away at such a rate that it was as much as I could do to keep pace with the donkey. There was a defiant manner about this young man, and particularly about the way in which he chewed straw as he spoke to me, that I did not much like. As the bargain was made, however, I took him upstairs to the room I was leaving, and we brought the box down and put it in his cart. Now, I was unwilling to put the direction card on there, lest any of my landlord's family should fathom what I was doing and detain me, so I said to the young man that I would be glad if he would stop for a minute, when he came to the dead wall of the King's Bench prison. The words were no sooner out of my mouth than he rattled away as if he, my box, the cart, and the donkey were all equally mad, and I was quite out of breath with running and calling after him, when I caught him at the place appointed. Being much flushed and excited, I tumbled my half-guinea out of my pocket in pulling out the card. I put it in my mouth for safety, and though my hands trembled a good deal, had just tied the card on very much to my satisfaction, when I felt myself violently chucked under the chin by the long-legged young man, and saw my half-guinea fly out of my mouth into his hand. "What?" said the young man, seizing me by the jacket collar with a frightful grin. "This is a police case, is it? You're a going to bolt, are you? Come to the police, you young warman, come to the police." "You give me back my money, if you please," said I, very much frightened, "and leave me alone." "Come to the police," said the young man. "You shall prove it yourn to the police." "Give me my box and my money, will you?" I cried, bursting into tears. The young man still replied, "Come to the police," and was dragging me against the donkey in a violent manner, as if there were any affinity between that animal and a magistrate, when he changed his mind, jumped into the cart, sat upon my box, and exclaiming that he would drive to the police straight, rattled away harder than ever. I ran after him as fast as I could, but I had no breath to call out with, and should not have dared call out now if I had. I narrowly escaped being run over 20 times at least in half a mile. Now I lost him, now I saw him, now I lost him, now I was cut with a whip, now I was shouted at, now down in the mud, now up again, now running into somebody's arms, now running headlong at a post. At length, confused by fright and heat, and doubting whether half London might not by this time be turning out from my apprehension, I left the young man to go where he would with my box and money; and panting and crying, but never stopping, faced about for Greenwich, which I had understood was on the Dover road, taking very little more out of the world towards the retreat of my aunt Miss Betsey than I had brought into it on the night when my arrival gave her so much umbrage. Chapter 13